Welcome back everyone to Law and Legal Process. I'm your Professor Shane Nelson, and in our previous lesson we focused heavily on ethics, morality, criminal liability, and in your readings you should have been able to establish the relationship between law and moral obligation. So we discussed several major ideas that are important to briefly just revisit today before moving into further constitutional law materials. So for example, we discussed that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s distinction between just and unjust laws. King argued that individuals have a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws through civil disobedience. And this raises an important question. Should legality and morality always be treated as the same thing? We also discussed Good Samaritan laws and duties to rescue. One important takeaway from that discussion is that American law generally does not impose a broad legal duty upon individuals to help strangers in need. Morally, many people believe that we should help others. I'm one of them. But legally, the obligation is often much narrower. In some states, they do have limited duties through Good Samaritan statutes. For example, certain laws may require individuals to report or intervene in very specific violent crimes. You should have also read about the case of the State v. Mobley, a case dealing with aiding and abetting liability. In that case, the court examined whether a statutory exemption protecting relatives from prosecution for harboring family members could also shield them when additional non-exempt felons were involved. And finally, we examined Gregg v. Georgia, where the Supreme Court held that the death penalty itself was not automatically unconstitutional under the 8th and 14th Amendments. Now, why does this all matter for today's lecture? Well, all of these prior discussions involve a central constitutional question. What power does government actually possess? And today we move from more moral and criminal responsibility into constitutional structure and federal power. One of the central features of the American legal system is federalism. Federalism means that governmental authority is divided between the federal government and the individual states. States possess broad powers called police powers. These police powers allow states to regulate things like public health, safety, welfare, and morality. This is why many criminal laws, including murder laws, theft laws, assault laws, and Good Samaritan statutes, are usually state laws rather than federal laws. Cases like State v. Mobley involved state criminal law because states generally possess authority over local criminal conduct. Similarly, Gregg v. Georgia involved a state criminal punishment system created by Georgia. But the federal government is different. The federal government only possesses powers specifically granted by the Constitution. One of the most important constitutional grants of federal power is the Commerce Clause. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. At first glance, this may sound straightforward, but over time, the Supreme Court had to determine different things like what counts as commerce, how broad is congressional authority, can Congress regulate local conduct, and can Congress regulate activity that is only indirectly affecting commerce. And if we rewind time back during the New Deal era of the 1930s, the Supreme Court began interpreting the Commerce Clause very broadly, and Congress used the Commerce Clause to justify things like labor laws, wage regulations, environmental laws, civil rights legislation, and just many other federal programs. The court often deferred to Congress whenever an activity substantially affected interstate commerce. So remember all of these expansions of federal authority, because all of these regulations and expansions bring us squarely into our case today of United States v. Lopez. So in 1995, the Supreme Court decided this case, and it became one of the most important federalism cases in modern constitutional law. A student named Alfonso Lopez brought a handgun into his Texas high school. He was charged under the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990. Lopez is literally just a kid bringing a handgun to school, and somehow this turns into one of the biggest federalism cases in modern U.S. history. So I think that's pretty funny, if nothing else. But notice how it's the federal government charging Lopez here, and not the state. And what they're saying is essentially that guns near schools affect education, and education affects the economy. And so the economy would affect interstate commerce. And so therefore, Congress can regulate this. And then the Supreme Court basically said, slow down, because by that logic, literally that means the commerce could affect anything somehow. So the court worried that if they accepted this argument, that Congress would basically gain unlimited power under the Commerce Clause. So they drew a constitutional line and said that possessing a gun near a school is not economic activity, and that it's too indirectly related to interstate commerce. So ironically, Lopez, this uneducated kid, had no idea that he was about to become a constitutional law legend, and he just walked into a school with a handgun and he accidentally reshaped federalism jurisprudence in the process. So this case became a huge federalism decision because the Supreme Court was drawing a firm line here and saying that not every bad thing automatically becomes a federal issue. So in other words, the court was protecting the balance of power between the federal government and the states. So the key takeaway here is that federal power is not unlimited. So crucially, try to remember that Lopez is one of the cases that reinforced federalism, and remember that federalism is the idea that power should be divided between the federal government and the states. So the court here was reminding everyone that the states have their own authority, especially over traditional criminal law and local policing matters. And this leads into the last point, that federal government is not a general police power. And that phrase might sound a little bit fancy, but it's really just me saying that federal government cannot police everything. States have what's called general police powers, meaning they can regulate for public safety, health, and welfare, as I discussed earlier, and the federal government, on the other hand, only has specific powers that are listed in the Constitution. So even though Lopez bringing a gun to school was obviously very dangerous and stupid, the court is still saying here that it doesn't automatically give Congress the authority to regulate this federally. And honestly, that's why Lopez matters so much today. It wasn't really about whether guns being in schools are bad. Everyone agrees that's bad. The real issue was, where does federal power stop? In this case also helps us connect back to our prior discussions involving ethics and criminal law. Think back to Good Samaritan laws. Could Congress create a nationwide federal law requiring all citizens to intervene in emergencies? Maybe morally some people would support that idea, but constitutionally Congress would still need a source of constitutional authority. And the case of Lopez reminds us that Congress cannot simply regulate every social issue merely because it affects society. Similarly, even though the Supreme Court upheld the death penalty in Gregg v. Georgia, criminal punishment systems are still primarily controlled by the states because criminal law traditionally falls under the state police powers. Now let's move forward to another enormously important Commerce Clause case, National Federation of Independent Business v. Sebelius in 2012. This case involved the Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare. One of the most controversial provisions was the individual mandate. So the law required individuals to either purchase health insurance or have to pay a financial penalty. So the federal government argued that this was constitutional under the Commerce Clause because everyone eventually has to participate in healthcare markets. Even uninsured individuals were affected by this interstate commerce because hospitals have to provide them with emergency care, and the costs will shift to the taxpayers, and of course insurance premiums will increase nationwide. Now this is where Chief Justice John Roberts made one of the most important constitutional distinctions in modern federalism and Commerce Clause history. The federal government argued that the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate was constitutional under the Commerce Clause because healthcare affects everyone. So the argument here is basically, hey, even if you don't buy insurance now, you're eventually going to have to participate in the healthcare market someday. And honestly, from a practical perspective, I mean, this argument does make some sense. But if uninsured people get sick or injured, hospitals still treat them in emergencies. Those costs don't disappear, and they get shifted to taxpayers, insurance companies, and eventually everyone else through higher premiums. So the government argued that healthcare is a national economic issue that affects interstate commerce. Now, Roberts steps in here and creates a huge constitutional distinction. Roberts said that Congress can regulate existing economic activity under the Commerce Clause, but Congress cannot force people into commerce in the first place just so it can regulate them afterward. And this is the key distinction. Regulating activity versus compelling activity. So Roberts worried that if the federal government could force citizens into buying something simply because not buying it affects the economy, then there would almost be no limit to federal power. Because then you could have arguments essentially stating something like, hey, well, everyone needs food, so you must buy broccoli, right? And yes, I mean, this is a famous broccoli hypothetical. It actually became part of a public discussion around this case. So Roberts is essentially stating here that the Commerce Clause lets Congress regulate commerce, but it does not give Congress the power to create commerce by forcing participation. And that became the constitutional line that he drew. So even though Roberts rejected the Commerce Clause argument, he still upheld the Affordable Care Act under Congress's taxing power. And this shocked a lot of people politically because many of the conservatives expected Roberts to strike the entire law down. But instead, he preserved most of the ACA while simultaneously placing a constitutional limit on the Commerce Clause power. Now, the court also addressed Medicaid expansion, and this became another major federalism issue. Congress wanted the states to expand Medicaid coverage under the Affordable Care Act. And on the surface, this sounds relatively straightforward. The federal government was basically trying to increase healthcare access for lower-income Americans. But the constitutional issue was how Congress tried to accomplish this. So, Congress told the states that if you refuse to expand Medicaid, you could lose a massive amount of your existing federal Medicaid funding. And for many states, Medicaid funding makes up a huge portion of their healthcare budgets. So the states argued this really isn't a choice, it feels more like an ultimatum or coercion, even a quid pro quo. And the Supreme Court actually agreed with this argument. So states could choose whether or not to expand Medicaid, but the federal government could not excessively punish them for refusing this. And again, this ties directly back into federalism. Ultimately, both Lopez and Sebelius revolve around one central constitutional issue. What are the limits of federal power? And earlier in the semester, we focused heavily on morality, ethics, criminal liability, and justice, and you've seen all of this throughout your readings. So some of the key takeaways that we've discussed here are Good Samaritan laws, duties to rescue, civil disobedience, aiding and abetting, and capital punishment. But today's lecture really shifted our attention more so to addressing constitutional structure itself. So even when a law appears to be socially beneficial, or if you can morally justify it, the federal government must still identify a constitutional source of authority for that law. And that's one of the Supreme Court's most important roles, determining the constitutional boundaries of government power. And cases like Lopez and Sebelius demonstrate that those boundaries continue to evolve time and time again.